Hey, in this chapter, what we're taking a look at here is the civil rights movement. So the period of time that we're going to be covering, at least for this next time period that we're discussing, is going to be about 1950, and we're going to take it all the way up to what is essentially the end of President Johnson's time in office, which is 1968. So we're kind of going right back to the time frame that we've done the last couple of chapters, which is right where we're going to see President Truman kind of step out of office, and we're going to see President Eisenhower step in, then through Presidents Kennedy and President Johnson. And what we're going to see here is that there's something unique about the 1950s and 1960s that makes the civil rights movement gain strength, gain speed, and achieve more of its objectives. So what we want to look at is why that happens. Why is it that the civil rights movement is going to make gains in post-war America? Why in the 1950s and 60s does it become successful? And then what's going to motivate our society to make changes and actually embrace these changes that the civil rights movement is pushing for in the 1950s and 1960s? And I think the thing to take from this is that it's a long, slow process that's going to pick up speed over time and put pressure on America. And that pressure begins in the 1950s once we come to the realization, North and South, that there still are two types of segregation in America. A legal segregation that we're familiar with, right, with Jim Crow laws, right? When the Supreme Court passes Plessy versus Ferguson, and it says that we're allowed to have separate but equal, we're allowed to have segregation, this doctrine of separate but equal means that our country legally can be separate, right? And we know that in 1898, or 1896 rather, when we condone segregation, we're going to enter that period that's going to run all the way up to 1954 when we see a legal challenge to that that's going to be successful. So that's legal segregation. And of course, remember the laws that we actually passed to enforce segregation, those are Jim Crow laws. But there's another kind of segregation as well, one that we don't really mention as much in our class or even in American society, and that's going to be de facto segregation. And that's kind of like segregation that we just accept as fact, as tradition, instead of legally. And let me give you an example of what de facto segregation can look like. So here's a little chart for you, a little infograph that talks about just in the last 30, 35 years, what neighborhoods look like in American cities and in American states. So if we said, okay, let's take your typical neighborhood for whites that you see up here on that top row, and let's just see what that looks like over time. What we'll see is that in 1980, there was a very small percentage of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans living in white neighborhoods. And look, between 1980 to 1990 to 2000 to 2010, that percentage has rarely changed. In other words, if you lived in a typically white neighborhood in 1980, chances are that same neighborhood in 2009, 2010, it's going to look the same, be about the same percentage white. You can do the same thing if you live at a typically African-American neighborhood. So in 1980, a typically African-American neighborhood was split roughly 50-50, 44-45 black-white with a small percentage of Latinos. Over time, a typical black neighborhood, if you look, it's about the same, right? About the same population of whites, a little more Hispanics, some fewer African Americans, but again, not much of a dramatic shift. And the same thing can be said for Latino neighborhoods. Those look about the same as well. America's neighborhoods in her cities, in her towns, in her states, they're as segregated now, for the most part, as they were in 1980. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an example of segregation by tradition, not by law. There's no law saying it has to be that way, but the tradition is that it is that way. Now, there are some victories against segregation, whether that's de facto or whether it's legal segregation, before the 1950s. And I put them here for you, whether that's World War II factories being integrated, whether that's Jackie Robinson desegregating baseball in 1942, the Truman integration of the military in 48, and so on. But the real assaults on segregation won't begin until the 1950s, when the civil rights movement gets organized And it's that organization which is going to put pressure on America, right? It's a long, slow process that's going to pick up speed with organization, and that organization is going to allow pressure to be exerted on white society in the 50s and 60s. And the group that does it is the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. And their method of persuasion, their method of pressure, is something called the sit-in. It's a form of protest, and CORE members, white and black, they'll go to restaurants, movie theaters, public pools, other kinds of facilities across the country, north and south, Chicago, Detroit, Denver, Syracuse, all in the north to start, and they will sit at segregated areas and force desegregation. So you see these people come in, whites and blacks, they sit together, boom, in an area that's supposed to be all for whites. The manager comes along and says, hey, you black people need to move. The whites and blacks together say, no, we're not moving. Make us. The police come in, the police have to drag them all out, and then they repeat the process again and again and again. What it does is create bad press, bad publicity, and it puts pressure on the owners because they're losing business. The more this kind of thing, and you can see here a lunch counter in the South being desegregated with members of CORE, white and black alike, sitting here getting things dumped on their heads. This is a loss of business for business owners, and that makes no sense. So they're going to put pressure on their governments to make change, and they're going to desegregate on their own. Did you notice where this desegregation starts, though? In the North. Why? Because it builds momentum in an area where it's not as violent. Remember, in the South, if you tried to get out of your place, if you were African American or if you were Latino, or if you were a white helping, you ran the risk of being lynched. In the North, that's not so bad, at least not as bad, the chances of being lynched. So it makes more sense to start in Detroit, Syracuse, etc., Denver, and then work your way south as you push for further and further desegregation. And this desegregation that begins to pick up speed with the organization that CORE provides and exert that pressure on white traditional segregation, we're going to see that continue to build speed and continue to exert even more influence once we realize that that pressure of desegregation is going to result in legal victories for African Americans against whites regarding segregation. It's going to result in a spark, a movement in the South where desegregation will be coming not just from the North with CORE, but also emerging in the South with a spark that kind of ignites all this tension, this pressure that's been building. And we're going to see the statement of a vision, what it means to protest, why we protest, with the emergence of leaders like Martin Luther King. So as we see the 1950s move forward, the first legal challenge that's going to come to segregation and really give us a difference is going to happen in 1954 with a court case that's very important that you need to know to be culturally relevant in America. It's called Brown versus the Board of Education, and you really need to pay attention to this court case. It's really important. In fact, let's make that be your little slip that you give us. Brown v. Board of Education. It's that important. And here's the idea. A little girl named, from the family of the Browns, Linda Brown, denied access to an all-white school, which is just a couple of blocks away from her house where she lives in Topeka, Kansas. She's forced to walk and ride a bus miles away to an all-black school, and she says this isn't fair. Her lawyer for the this court case is a guy named Thurgood Marshall. I've got my pointer on him here for you. He actually later becomes a justice on the Supreme Court, but he is the chief lawyer of the NAACP. And the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is going to say, this isn't right. Why does Linda Brown have to walk and ride a bus so far away in order to go to school? It looks like Mrs. Davenport's leaving. Bye, Mrs. Davenport. Bye. Is there anything I need to do for tomorrow? No. No, she says we're done. Sweet. So a bunch of these court cases are going to get all balled together. They're going to go to the Supreme Court. And what we're going to see here is the Supreme Court, for the first time since 1896, say that segregation, at least in schools, is unconstitutional. That separate is not equal in this case. That's a big deal. because for the first time, segregation will be challenged. And you can understand how whites react to this, right? Whites are going to feel threatened. CORE is coming from the north, working their way south, putting pressure on businesses to desegregate. You see schools wanting to be desegregated by now. You're going to see Southerners respond to a call from Harry Byrd, a senator from West Virginia. At this point, he was from Virginia, rather, I should say, West Virginia, say that we should resist the ruling. We should not accept this ruling. And Southerners will rise up in the South and they will say, we will not desegregate our schools because some court tells us to. And so what they'll do is come up with a crafty way to fight against it. Instead of saying that segregation is based on race, what they'll say is it's based on something psychological or some other kind of a test. And they'll call it a pupil assignment law. And they'll say that you can't attend a certain school unless you have a certain literacy rate. And if you don't read well, you have to go to this school over here where they'll help you with reading. Well, of course, we know what that looks like, because in African American schools, they don't have access to quality education, so they're not reading on grade level. So if you say all the kids who don't read well have to go to this school over here, of course, that's going to be the school for all the black kids. Or if you do what North Carolina does, and you say, well, we don't want kids to feel psychologically pressured by going to school with people that don't necessarily resemble them in their skin color. So we're going to have people attend schools with people from their similar social economic class so that they don't feel, too self-conscious. Well, then you're going to end up with white kids going to school with white kids and black kids going to school with black kids. And these laws will persist for a long time. By 1964, 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education, there are still states where 0 to 1% of African Americans are in school with whites. In other words, there's no desegregation. So in 1964, we still have a really high percent where less than 1% of African Americans are in schools with whites. Look at those percentages, 0.6% in Louisiana in with white students, 0.05% of black kids in white schools in Georgia, 0.007% of black kids in white schools in Alabama. Within 10 years after this ruling. So it's obviously going to go to the Supreme Court, right? Obviously, the Supreme Court is going to look at this and say, dude, this is just not right. You just can't keep this up. You can't keep doing this. And so the Supreme Court is going to look at this and they're going to say, you're right. You're right. You can't use these pupil assignment laws. You have to end segregation with all deliberate speed. What does that even mean? If you do something deliberately, doesn't that mean you take your time with it and make sure you do it right? Well, if I'm supposed to do something deliberately with speed, does that mean I do it fast or that I do it slow? That ambiguity, that questionable phrasing is going to let southern states prevent desegregation all the way up until 1969. And here's the interesting thing. If you look at this in terms of race even now, de facto segregation based on neighborhoods shows tons of school districts around the country that are still highly segregated. In blue are the schools that are incredibly highly segregated where 75% or more of the students are non-white. And then in the lighter colors, at least 25% of the population is still white. In other words, schools where we have a high population of still white people. All over the country, we see high numbers of still segregated schools. So what, you say, right? At least it's a victory. It's a legal victory. That's true. Even though it takes more than a decade and in many ways is still not completely taken care of, it's still a victory. And that victory will encourage African Americans in the South to continue to push for more change. A spark is provided in the South as well to all this tension and pressure when Rosa Parks in 1955 refuses to move to the back of the bus. And you've seen this, of course, before, but you need to know Rosa Parks is not some goody two-shoes. Rosa Parks works for the NAACP, and she's an outspoken critic of segregation. She has worked hard, and she works for decades, really, even prior to this issue with the bus, to encourage African Americans to fight back. In response to her arrest for not moving to the back of the bus. We're going to see a bus boycott emerge. And here's an example of that bus boycott, where we'll see African Americans using car rides, carpooling, and that's actually what you see here. You see African Americans driving their cars around looking for other African Americans who are calling for a ride because they won't take the bus. And this is an example of where the civil rights movement is it's going. It's going to be happening now, one thing after another throughout the 50s into the 60s. This is all brought to a head in part, not just because of Rosa Parks' spark or the legal victories of Brown v. Board of Education, but because there are emerging leaders which give a vision, a voice to this effort, like Martin Luther King. He's a pastor like so many other leaders in the civil rights movement who come from churches in the 1950s and 60s. And what they say, and what King says, is that we need to non-violently resist. We need to push for change and do so in a way that is non-violent. And what he says is we have to protest, we have to provoke. If we don't protest, if we don't provoke, then we can't make change because, as King says, and here's part of your short answer, white people have been taught hatred and prejudice when they're young. If we don't protest, if we don't change, then nothing will change. Look, we don't have to totally blame white people for their racism and hatred because they've been taught it from a young age. But what we have to do is use love and protest as a way of showing their mistake. Not violence, love, to show them that they're wrong, to encourage them to understand. He says we must use the weapon of love. So many people are taught to hate us, they're not totally responsible for their hate. So yes, we have to protest because so many people aren't responsible. We have to help them. We have to teach them love since they've been taught hate. You're going to see these ministers, many again of whom are from churches, kind of use this message of protest and nonviolence and love to take the civil rights movement from just sit-ins in the North, from just court cases like Brown v. Board, and make it spread throughout the South. Obviously, you're going to see whites continue to fight this and resist this as it spreads throughout the South. Here's an example. A case study is going to be how President Eisenhower deals with southern states that resist desegregation. For example, Eisenhower himself doesn't think that you can pass a law and just make people stop being racist. And he's right. You can't make someone stop being racist because there's a law. You're going to have the South resist this, which is why King says we have to encourage people and teach people to love. So when we see the South rise up and fight back, like in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the Supreme Court says that the all-white school of Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas, has to allow black students in, it's why you could expect to see the governor, Orville Faubus, this guy right here, come out on TV and say he's against all racial integration at any school in the Little Rock School District. And that's going to bring whites to his banner, whites that feel threatened, whites that are afraid of losing control, whites that are afraid of losing power, whites that are afraid of change and equality. So Orville Faubus is going to say, you know what? I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that anger, that tool to get reelected, and I'm going to use the armed forces, the National Guard of Arkansas, to oppose the federal government. It's the first time since the Civil War a state used its armed forces to resist the government in Washington, D.C. So Eisenhower has a choice. He knows he can't pass a law and make people stop being racist, but is he going to let a state totally disregard the rules? That'd be insane. Instead, what he does is become the first president since the Civil War and Reconstruction to send armed troops, the 101st Airborne, into the South to escort those kids in and uphold federal law. These students become known as the Little Rock Nine, and what they become known as the Little Rock Nine, are beacons for change. So what this shows here is the civil rights movement kind of getting underway. It shows all the changes that are made. It shows how this change happens. It shows the pressure that CORE puts on its organization. It shows the vision of Martin Luther King with protest and love. It shows the spark from Rosa Parks, which spreads it across the South. And it shows the resistance of whites and how the government is going to deal with that. And we'll do more with this in class tomorrow.